how, like, the thread we are in now, it's a part of the open seminars of St. Leopold at the VUB. I'm kind of introducing more formally because I see people that haven't been participating yet, and we are cross-listing because within this broader seminar series, we are organizing a sequence of a few seminars given by the participants of our first year of the School of Thinking, and Jan is among those participants. So we are what we usually do is that we record those seminars, most of them, because not every speaker wishes to be recorded, and we put those videos in the YouTube channel of CLEA. And you can see it there. So we can also list, like, we can add the link to the slides there. The question is, Jan, do you wish it to be recorded and put on YouTube?
I have no objection, Marta.
Okay, so fine. So I'm recording. I will do that. If you send me the file, I'll link it.
Okay.
Link it later. Okay.
Okay.
So I don't know. I think we are already quite. It's quite a large group already. So why won't we start?
We start?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, I hope everybody is seeing the PowerPoint now.
Yeah, very good.
Okay. The lecture of today is about Socrates and, of course, the Socratic thinking. First of all, I want to have a glimpse on what we are going to do this evening, this time during this lecture. First of all, why Socratic thinking? Secondly, something about Socrates himself, of course. Then, as a third item, the Socratic way of thinking today, because this is, in some ways different from the old days. Then a fourth item is the benefits of Socratic thinking. Fifth item is, when is Socratic thinking useless? And sixth, if we still have time, in what fields is Socratic thinking applied? Okay, why Socratic thinking? I can imagine that some of you are thinking, why use an old technique? Why use something which is 2,500 years old? Why should this also matter these days? Well, the idea behind it was that one does not gain understanding by getting it dished up, but only by thinking for oneself. First of all, I have to make a clear distinction between a debate and a dialogue. There's a very nice distinction between those two. A debate is, in fact, reasoning, using arguments, trying to convince someone else, or yourself, or a group. And then you use, of course, rhetorics within logos, pathos, ethos, and also the use of fallacies. I will not elaborate on that because I want to stress on the dialogue itself, the dialogue by Socrates. In dialogue, in contradiction of the debate, you are trying to find out, you are seeking for the truth together. So we speak of dialectics, informal logic, applied epistemology, and I will explain that later on in the slides. In fact, it's asking questions, and by answering, new questions are raised, deep questioning, in fact. You have to listen very well, and you have to delay your judgment. Today, there are many variants or many methods of Socratic thinking. It's not like in the old days, of course. Well, there's a big spectrum of Socratic thinking, and you will see that in a few moments. One of my, this is a quote I wrote myself, because I'm rather a fan of Ubuntu philosophy, South African. And I wrote this: the mirror is only a passive reflection of what and who we are, but you have to go one step further to what is called the active mirror. That is a conversation between two people. Another person not only reflects your image, but also talks back. If you have been able to face your own shortcomings, you have actually learned to listen to the other. And if you can listen, if the other can listen, there is room for a real conversation. From that conversation, something new can arise, a lot can come out of it. That's Ubuntu philosophy. And you will see further in the lecture that Socratic thinking is about listening, listening to the other, listening carefully and setting aside judgment for the moment. One can ask himself, why dialogues? What are the advantages of the dialogues that were written by Plato? Because you know, Socrates himself never wrote anything on paper. It was Plato and also Xenophon who wrote the dialogues, and mostly Plato, of course. There are some philosophical and literary benefits, and I will explain this to you. First of all, you have the drama. Why drama? Because in the dialogues of Socrates, you see Socrates in the streets, on the market, the agora, and he's talking to other people. And in fact, nothing comes in between those two people. It's only Socrates talking to the opponent. And so there's nothing that interferes that dialogue. Secondly, you have the historical data. If you look at the opponents of Socrates in these dialogues, you see that he is talking to people who are or rich or poor, well educated or not well educated. And for instance, a very good example is Meno, where he is trying to convince us, where he is getting out of the slave the proof of a mathematical problem. Three, it's also a form of philosophy. It's a form of questioning. It's searching in dialogue. It's a question, it's an answer. Together seeking ideas must be tested. So you have to criticize and you have to rebut, of course. It's also a form of didactical process. In fact, you have here the teacher and the learner or the pupil. And in fact, in the Socratic methods, they should be equal. There's no teacher, there is no pupil, they are at the same level. There's no difference between those two. And the teacher here is more a coach than a teacher, and that you will see in the anamnesis and the maieutic phase of the Socratic thinking, which we will see a little bit later. And then, as a fifth item, here you have conversation against the written text. Of course, a dialogue, like it's written here in the dialogues of Plato, were not performed in that way. These dialogues are stylized. There's nobody who is talking like that to each other in the way it is written down in the dialogues. So here you have a written text which is static and not dynamic, which is a dialogue. Of course, that's a dynamic process. And in fact, philosophizing, you have that to do that with the Latin word viva voce. With the voice, you have to speak to each other, and it's a dynamic process. Once it's written, nothing can be changed anymore. So that's the disadvantage, of course, of the dialogue. Later, we will see that there are methods where they write down the dialogues which were done by, well, exact dialogues which were done with other people. And then sometimes you will see, for instance, okay, the dialogue is now interrupted for a moment because John had to go to the toilet, and everything is written down as it appeared in the dialogue, not so with the dialogues of Plato. We are not sure if the ideas in the dialogues of Plato are the ideas of Socrates, or is it the projection of the ideas of Plato, or both of it. So that's something, well, you can figure out, of course. The source for this, I have to mention that, is by Professor Dr. Ineke Sluiter, who is a professor at the University of Leiden. Okay, second item, Socrates himself. Well, Socrates was born in 469 before our time, and he died in 399 before our time in Athens. He was a Greek philosopher and married to Xanthippe when he was 50 years old. And one of the quotes of Socrates he seems to have said at that time, whatever you do, you marry or you don't marry, you will regret it. He was the son of a midwife and a sculptor, and he speaks in the streets, as already said, and on the marketplace, and he does that for free, in opposite of the sophists who asked money for that. Two things that are very known quotes by Socrates: I know that I don't know, and know yourself, or in Greek, noti seauton. Socrates has a critical mind. He targets especially politicians. No writings from himself. Is considered as one of the founders of Western philosophy. He was indicted to for corrupting the youth and sentenced to the poison cup. And of course, we have also Plato, who was a student of Socrates, and of course the teacher of Aristotle, and very well known for the dialogue, so which has been said already. So we come to the word dialectics. In fact, what is dialectics? It's generally a form of reasoning that seeks truth through the use of opposites. And I will elaborate on that a little bit furthermore. You see here three kinds of arguments. The first kind of argument is the apodictical argument. The second one, the dialectical, and the third, the rhetoric. And you see the purpose of these three arguments are different. In apodictical, there's the certainty. In the dialectical, it's the acceptability, and in the rhetorics, it's the persuasion. So in the first case, it's the premises are clearly true. In the dialectical, acceptable, and in the rhetoric, they are convincing, because they have to convince the public. Rhetoric. Now, the method in brief. I will explain you very briefly the method of the Socratic talkings, and then we will elaborate it with an example to have a deeper insight. Socrates, together with a few others, tries to find definitions of certain general concepts. And I give you a few examples in a moment. Now, you see an asterisk after the word others, and it means it needs some explanation. The others, who are they? They're usually people who are supposed to be provisioned in the field of that general concept. We will see that, for instance, he is asking the definition of courage, and he asks this to a general in the war. When he asks something that is concerned with law, he asks it to a lawyer. So every time he is asking people who are provisioned for that field, and in fact, in the elenchus-phase, which we will encounter in a few minutes, he is embarrassing those people because they don't know. And he is proving that they do not know what they are saying. And he's by asking and asking again. So Socrates embarrasses these individuals because they cannot give consistent answers to these questions, and that time after time. And then he uses the technique of the midwife through anamnesia, remembering, so that the knowledge which is already there can be born. You know, his mother was a midwife who gave birth to children. Midwives were women who couldn't have children anymore, but could help other women to give birth to children. And in fact, the abstract formulation of the question Socrates is asking is the what is X question. Okay. Here are some examples from Plato's Dialogues, for instance, in the Laches, which I already mentioned a few minutes ago. What is courage? What is knowledge in the Dictators? What is self-control in the Charminedes? What is love? Symposium. Very nice text, the Symposium. I recommend the reading of this, and so on, and so on. And of course, today, we also have what is X questions, which we can use or in education or in, for instance, organizations. What is respect? What is artistry? What is authenticity? What is autonomy? And so on, and so on. We come now to the method in a more extensive explanation. And I will use 3 examples. The examples of Laches and courage, Euthyphro and piety, and the Meno, which is about virtue, or in a word that in Greek means, it means areté. So what is X question? What is courage? What is piety? What is virtue? And then you see that the people who he's talking to, they answer in different ways. They answer in different ways. For instance, what is courage? The question for Laches in the dialogue. Well, Laches says, okay, Socrates, this is a very, very simple question. And the answer is very simple. You have to stay on your post. You never leave your post for the enemy. You don't run away from the enemy. Then you have courage, Andrea. You have Andrea in Greek. In the Euthyphro, the same thing happens. Immediately, Euthyphro gives an answer to the question of what is piety. And the answer of Euthyphro is something what I'm doing now, prosecuting my father who is guilty of manslaughter. Not doing that is not piety. You have to know that Euthyphro was there together, meets Socrates at the stairs of the court, court where they judge criminals and so on. And Socrates is there for his own process, and Euthyphro is there for the process of his father. So he says, what I'm doing now, okay, it's my father, but he has done wrong, so I have to prosecute him. After these first answers of the opponents, in fact, Euthyphro is not satisfied because he doesn't want, he wants definitions, and all they are giving to him are examples of that X, but not the essence. A last example, for instance, in the Meno, where he is asking for the virtue, Meno's answer is has different aspects. He says, for instance, for a woman or for a man, it's very simple. It's doing the right things for his friends and doing politics. For a woman, it's doing housekeeping and obey her husband. For children, it's also otherwise, and it depends on if it's a boy or a girl. So that's also different, and so on. And for an old man, and for a young man, and so on. So different answers. Then the technique that Socrates is using is the technique of the counter examples. And I give you one example. For instance, he says, okay, if I have a knife that I borrowed from someone else, do I have to give back that knife to the man who borrowed me? Yes, of course, Socrates. Okay, he says, but let's suppose that when I give back the knife and I know that the one who I'm borrowed from will do some harm to others, do I have to give it back to them, to him then, or not? You see, he's asking with a counter example to see if what is X stands if you have what is X on the counter example. There are other kinds of comportments, for instance, for the courage. He says, for instance, okay, you say courage is staying on your post, not running away from the enemy, but is that the same for a doctor, for instance? Can you say that courage for a doctor is also that definition? No, of course not. So he embarrasses again and again the answers because the answers are not satisfying. And then after a few examples, explanations, follows a second one, a third one, and so on. And at a certain moment, they arrive at the poets, because the poets at that time were the authorities who could say what it was, how it was, and so on. For instance, the poets say for Euthyphro beautiful sentences like piety is what is loved by the gods. Or another one is something pitiful because the gods love it, or is something loved by the gods because it's pitiful. You see here, and this I say between brackets, the difference between the objective way of looking at values and the subjective way of looking at values. And maybe you all know Jan Hus, who is considered as the art pope, or was considered as the art pope in our country. And you can make from this sentence, for instance, is something good because Jan Hus says that is something art because Jan Hus says it's art, or is art art because it is art. You see the difference between those two. I will not elaborate on that because this would lead us too far in our story, but that's what I wanted to say between brackets. And then, of course, after time and time and time, they get into apory. There is no one except Socrates who knows any longer what the right answer must be. In fact, they give up. They don't know. And then, of course, this is, of course, the end of the deconstructive part, the elenchus part, not knowing, showing that the opponents know nothing. They don't know the answers, the elenchus. And then comes, of course, the constructive part, the maieutic. Through anamnese, he is giving birth to the thoughts, which are already in the person himself. Now, when dialogue, elenchus-phase, becomes a kind of debate, convincing, maieutic phase, and for instance, the example in the Euthyphro, he is more making argumentations, and I will show you that with the model of Toulmin. Toulmin is a British philosopher, British American philosopher, who wrote The Uses of Argument in, I believe, 1956. And I will show you, I'll explain you first the model itself. When you make a claim, and that claim can be a fact, but it can also be a value or whatever, you have to go from a datum or data, more datum, the plural of datum, data. You connect the data to claim, and you do that by a warrant. The warrant is sustained by a backing. Then you can say it with 100% unless you have a rebuttal, so that you have a qualifier. Maybe this is a little bit difficult to understand without an example, and I will give you the example of in Toulmin's book. The claim is there: Harry is a British subject. How can you say that Harry is a British subject? Well, you can say that because Harry is born in Bermuda, and someone who is born in Bermuda is a British subject. That's the warrant. That's the way you can bridge from data to claim. And how do you know that? Well, it's in the law. It's written in the law that someone who is born in Bermuda is a British subject. Except one rebuttal, for instance, would be he is naturalized as an American. And then the qualifier means that the 100% claim is not true, but for instance, probably he is a British subject. Well, you see here, you have the bridge between datum and claim, and it is in fact backed and and warranted, because these two are in fact making that bridge true and sustain that bridge, of course. And you see, I have put here some of a part of a dialogue in the Euthyphro. The claim is, holy is just what I'm doing now. So that's what Euthyphro is saying. Euthyphro is there to say that his father has done wrong. Holy, and it is holy to do that. I'm prosecuting my father as a wrongdoer, and that's data. That's the fact. The warrant that makes the bridge between that data and the claim is prosecuting wrongdoers, whether in cases of murder or temple robbery or those guilty of any other such offense, be they one's father or mother or anyone else, whatever. One must not tolerate an impious man, no matter who he may happen to be. And the backing, therefore, you see here, the backing is, of course, the poets, the gods, and so on. Zeus, as best and most righteous of the gods, and admits that he put his father in bonds for wrongfully gobbling up his children, and that father in turn castrated his father for similar misdeeds. And then you have here a rebuttal, which is in fact a rebuttal coming from a counter-argument. The counter-argument is they contradict themselves in what they say about the gods and about me. Because you had, at that time, you had many gods, and not all the gods are saying the same thing. So who is speaking the truth? So the rebuttal is, and yet they are also angry with me because I follow one of the gods. So the qualifier is probably here a strong qualifier, because he is making that statement, that claim on with reference to the gods. Something interesting, maybe also between brackets, but it was too beautiful to not have this in the PowerPoint. You see, who is indicted here in Socrates' lawsuit? It is Socrates by Meletus, and in the Euthyphro, it's Euthro's father by Euthyphro. And the accusation is religious innovation and corruption of the young, and in the other one, crime. And you see here also, when you look deeper into the dialogue, it's also always a younger one who is indicting an elder person. That's very, very, well, this is not always common in dialogues, but here in that dialogue, you find this back. Conclusion on Socratic thinking by Socrates for the moment is that Socratic thinking and talking, which would be considered as a community of inquiry, and I think it's not like it's done in the old days. And I confer here to the method of McCall, because community of inquiry is a term of method. The start of the dialogue is also what is X. The question after question is all, that's the elenchus that appears also, and the constructive phase, the maieutic, which can be compared with a copy method, the community of philosophical investigation. But if you look at the dialogues in the constructive phase, it is often Socrates who is giving the answers. The partners in dialogue restrict themselves often by saying, "It seems so, Socrates," or "I believe indeed it is," and so on. For instance, the most known example, I think I mentioned it already, is Meno, in the Meno, where a slave solves a mathematical problem. But in fact, if you look at the dialogue, it is Socrates who is saying what the answer is. And the slave is always saying, "Oh, yes, indeed, Socrates," and so on there. And he's nodding, yes, yes, yes. Maybe this is a little extract from a very good book from Pigliucci, Nonsense on Stills, where Socrates, and you see here in the dialogue how it happens. If the wise man or any other man wants to distinguish the true physician from the false, how will he proceed? He who would inquire into the nature of medicine must test it in health and disease, which are the sphere of medicine, and not in what is extraneous and is not in its sphere. You see, he is giving the answer, and the other guy says, "True." And then Socrates says, and he who wishes to make a fair test of the physician, as a physician will test him in what relates to these. He will consider whether what he says is true and whether what he does is right in relation to health and disease. He will. But can anyone pursue the inquiry into either unless he has a knowledge of medicine? He cannot, and so on and so on. You see, in fact, this is not a dialogue in the sense of that the others in the maieutic phase, in the constructive phase, are giving the answers. Sometimes they do, but it's mostly Socrates who is saying what it is and so on. Okay, we come to the Socratic thinking of Socratic way of thinking of today. I already mentioned that there are many variants, and I have some here. You have, for instance, the Nelson-Hickman method, the copy method by McCall. Copy stands for Community of Philosophical Inquiry. The Lippmann method, the P4C, which means philosophy for children. Sapere, Brunifier, Tozzi, Richard Paul, and Linda Elder, Freddy Mortira, Richard Antole, with Socrates on the playground, on the speelplaats. So many methods. Now, these different methods, of course, are all done within the spirit of Socrates, of course. And it would take us too far to explain all those methods, because this is not my intention, of course. I will explain one a little bit further, a little more in detail. I have to choose, of course. You see, this is a content which lasts at least 9 hours for the students at university. So that time we do not have. So I have to summarize a little bit. But to summarize all those methods, you can say that there are in fact always three main parts in the Socratic way of thinking of today. There's a beginning part, a middle part, and an end part. The beginning part is or a real situation, so not hypothetical, and sometimes the starting position is a hypothetical question, or a story, or a media like pictures, photos, videos, music, and so on. The middle part, the method is mainly asking and asking again, and suspend your own judgment, and in that you have big differences, of course. And then the end is, you could say, well, they are striving for a consensus, or they are not striving for a consensus. That's also possible. Now, before I start the method of the hourglass method, I'd like to explain first of all this item. It's in fact the regressive abstraction used by Nelson. Starting from a concrete example, one traces back, regresses to the presuppositions that lie at the foundation of the example. By inquiring into these presuppositions, which are of course necessary so as to come to the specific judgments in the example, one goes back to the foundations upon which these judgments are based. It is in this way that we develop a general understanding, an abstraction. And when I give the example, it will be more clear what is written down here. For instance, if you have the sentence, when is something unnecessary luxury? That's what is X question. For instance, this chair and this sofa, which I like to buy, for instance, are not an unnecessary luxury. In fact, I have made here a judgment. I have made a conclusion of a syllogism. And how can I say that? Well, if you want to buy something and the item meets a practical need, which it is, it has an important aesthetic added value, and you are aware of what you are doing, and so on, then it's not an unnecessary luxury. Justification, the Maeyer in the syllogism, the purchase of this chair and this sofa met those conditions, the facts from the example, the Meno. And here you have that regressive abstraction, the regressive syllogism and the progressive syllogism put in opposite to each other. On the right column, you see the normal syllogism, the progressive syllogism, Maeyer, minor, conclusio. Maeyer, if X, Y, Z, then A. Minor, X, Y, Z are the case. So conclusio is A. In the regressive syllogism is what we are doing in the technique of regressive abstraction. We start from a conclusion, A, and then we try to seek the Maeyer. If X, Y, Z, then A, well, we see in fact, in reality, or we have the constatation that X, Y, Z are the case. So we are returning back to the conclusion, or starting from the conclusion and going regressive to the Maeyer and Meno. So in the context of Socratic conversation, used in the Aristotle way, then it's rather an induction and not a regressive abstraction. In the induction, searching abstract judgments and justifications from a series of hypothetical examples. You see, in the first case, we had one example, one real example. Now we have hypothetical examples, and we make induction. You know, we have deduction, induction, abduction, we have different kinds. Well, we make it by induction. And here you see, I haven't put this in English, but you have here the claims, waar beweringen staat, we have the claims, and then examples of the claims, and we have induction 1, induction 2, and 3. And of course, it's possible that within one claim, many examples are possible with a variation within the examples. Now, if you put those two variants against each other, of Socrates' method, like described in Plato, you have, for instance, the Nelson-Heckman method and the Aristotle way of doing these dialogues. In the Nelson-Heckman, you start from one concrete example. In the Aristotle way, you have a few hypothetical examples. In the Nelson-Heckman and in the Aristotle way, you are trying to get rules and principles. And in the first case, you do it by regressive abstraction, which I explained, and induction in the other case. More than two people against conversation between two. And you see here, and that's important for education, the teacher has a less substantive steering role in the Nelson-Heckman method. In the Aristotle, it's the teacher who has the substantive steering role. So in the one case, it's seeking consensus together. In the other way it's rather teaching pupil hierarchy. And you know all the painting by Raphael, the School of Athens, where you have Plato and Aristotle. And Plato is with his finger pointing upwards, and Aristotle is with his finger pointing downwards. It's down there, and Plato, it's up there. There's of course a practical problem in abstraction, because you can ask the following question: how do you know when you've reached the truth? And Nelson, which we saw earlier, is giving the following answer. How do you know when you have reached the truth? Since reason is a faculty that all people have, then the truth that one was seeking would be found within all reason. That is, within everyone's thinking. The truth is therefore the same for everyone. So, a practical way of letting the truth arrived at through regressive abstraction would be to test it, to see that if anyone reaches a different conclusion, if even one person did reach a different conclusion after the correct application of the regressive abstraction, then neither that person nor the others have reached the truth, because by its nature, there is one truth. Okay, consequences for the education. And normally I would have put this slide at the end of my PowerPoint presentation, but I give it here because here we have, in fact, for education, a change of perspective. In fact, we come from episteme of scientific knowledge to phronesis, practical wisdom. Today's we have still dogmatic method instead of Socratic method. We are saying to the people, okay, this is what you have to know. A, B, C, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. Instead of Socratic method where they try to search the truth and the content for themselves. It's a transfer of concepts versus making observations. It's explanation of theories rather than analysis of experiences. Outer knowledge versus inner connection. And maybe in times of Corona, I do find this a very nice sentence, which I translated from the book of Kessel's Socrates on the Marketplace. If education is to be effective, education must not only include the transfer of knowledge, but also Socratic or Socratically infected conversations. I think in times of Corona, this is maybe a very, very beautiful sentence to pronounce what we are saying. So you have the three, well, we saw two words already, episteme and phronesis. Episteme is saying is in fact the scientific knowledge. Phronesis, the practical wisdom, and in between you have the technique, the craftsmanship, the maieutic. And here you see, very interesting to notice that you have a transfer from woman to man. You know, in those days, midwives were women. Nowadays, the majority of the midwives are still, I think, women. I don't know the percentage. There are also men who are midwives. But the midwives at that time were elder women who couldn't give birth anymore to children, but gave birth to the other women. And here you see in the maietics the transfer to man, because Socrates, as a man, is a midwife to give birth to knowledge to other men, and not women, but only men at that time. Luckily, that is changed nowadays. And so we come to our hourglass method, and I give you this first in a global scheme. In the hourglass model, we start with a question, then an example, the core statement, the rules out of it, and the principles. And this is how it works. A question is at the starting point, and is also is in fact the focus of the research. The example is the facts, the story. The core claim or statement, the heat point, the claim under investigation. The rules that are the justification of the arguments on which the judgment is based. And the principles, the justification for the rules. So, in fact, this is the method proposed by Nelson. He was convinced that philosophical truth can be found, finding truth through regressive abstraction, the method. By analyzing our experience, we get to the more general judgments and assumptions. So we go back from consequences to the reasons and the judgment. In this way, we can expose obscure assumptions that are at the heart of our views. There are some rules, of course, to have those dialogues. One, everybody who is in the dialogue has to postpone their judgment. They have to listen accurately. They have to be concrete. They have to ask for the facts. They have to think for themselves. Do not lean on knowledge or authority of others. They have to tolerate not knowing. They have to disuse the empathy, and they have to use the other person's words in the question. Well, let's have the example. The question is, do you have to give unsolicited comments on how someone dresses? That's the question. Now, there are some criteria for an initial question. It must be a general issue, and of course of a certain substantial nature. Not any question is okay to have a dialogue. It must be non-empirical, to be answered through reflection only. For instance, you can't have a question which is a first order question. A question where the answer is it can be found in a book or in whatever. It must be also relevant for the participants, and we will see that here, that this question was used in education, in a school, among teachers. It must be formulated in a provokingly way, but also simple, with a minimum of troublesome concepts. If you have, of course, words in your question, in your initial question, which are also doubtful or can have many other meanings, then it's not formulated simply. And it must have to be easily supplied with concrete examples from personal experience. So the concretizing, the asking for examples, the attendees had several examples on that question. And the example that was chosen was the example of Mariette. What I'm telling now is a true story. In fact, it's a true dialogue, which, of course, now is a little bit condensated to a few elements. And Mariette, she said, okay, as a teacher, I had a trainee at the school who always wore 2 small sweaters and skirts in which her voluptuous shapes came out very well. Mariette wondered if she should point this out to the trainee. So you see the situation. Situation is a young woman dressed well, according to Mariette, not in a way that is suitable, and she is explaining it with these words. Now, what the others are doing now is examining this example. After this brief description of the example, the participants in the dialogue ask Mariette questions. And first of all, we have what we call the topic questions, that are the 5 W and the 1 H question: who, what, where, when, what, how, what was done, what was taught, what was felt, and also the motives in those facts. So they are asking Mariette, okay, you had that situation now, and they ask her everything to have a clear view on what the example in fact is. In fact, what was the problem she encountered, and so on. So they're asking like a police officer who is asking someone who is maybe a wrongdoer, how was it, what did you do then, and so on and so on. The criteria for a good example, they chose that example because the example connects, of course, first very well with the initial question. The presenter of the example knows the example from personal experience. It was Mariette who knew that example. She experienced that example in real life. The young woman in that case is not an invented woman. It is a case that really happened. The presenter, Mariette here in that case, has a role in the example, is not a spectator, is immediately confronted with the situation. The example must have been ended, so the Mariette here is no longer involved in the situation, that's finished. The other participants can relate to the example easily, so they can put themselves into the situation of Mariette. It is not necessary to explain technical or theoretical aspects of the example to be able to understand it. The presenter, here Mariette, can tell the example fully, and the simpler, the better. Now, the technique is now, there occurs a displacement, a move. The participants in the dialogue are now moving into the position of the one whose example was chosen, here Mariette, and imagine how they would deal with this issue. This is the collective self-reflection that is also an important part of the Socratic conversation. And in fact, the participants in the dialogue are now in the situation of Mariette, in the heat point, they say, and there are three important questions that are asked to everybody in the dialogue. First of all, what would you feel? Not what Mariette feels, but what would you feel in that situation? What would you think in that situation? And what would you do? And the participants are asked to answer their, or to write their answers on a sheet of paper. And then afterwards, they had to tell what the preliminary verdict is in the heat point. So after this, and it takes 10 minutes, 15 minutes to write it down, the participants are now ready to read what they have written down in the questions about feeling, thinking, and doing. And I give you a few of these answers that were given, not all of them, of course, because of the time, but to give you an idea. Someone was saying, for instance, It's a pity. Everyone sees it and she doesn't. They're talking about a trainee. It's in fact a pity. Everybody sees that this is not correct, but she, the girl, the young woman, doesn't see that. It's a pity. Another one who says about feelings, well, disbelief that someone can dress like that. How is it possible that you dress like that? And another one says, I feel vicarious shame. Shame instead of the young woman, I feel shame also. As thoughts, a few examples that were given, where, well, you have to think, girl. Trainee, you have to think. If you're still spinning your ass at this age, you don't think. And another sentence was, wonder about lack of self-understanding. And Mariette came up with this extra reflection, I don't want to hurt anyone by saying this, she might find me annoying. And then at last, do. Also a few examples of answers, compelling to say something to the trainee, understanding the trainee and taking advantage of this to let her have her own learning process. Letting her know this is the effect. Do you want this? It also bothers me as a teacher. What's your responsibility? Another one said, I would have filmed the situation and discussed it with her. That's an action. The boys, the pupils, need also to be addressed, not just the trainee. Or I would have made it very clear what can and what cannot concerning clothing. So you see, you have here different answers on the three major questions that were asked. And then you have preliminary statements regarding the question. And this is written on a flip chart, a flip board, or on the blackboard. It depends on the context. Another one was, who sets the standards or the standard? Another one, yes, you have to say something, but you have to be very clear. And a last one, no, first you have to try to understand the other person better. And the other person here is mentioned, of course, the trainee. And then comes a very important phase in that hourglass method. The participants are now asked to give another answer to the central question and to argue their answers on the basis of the case. And Mariette is also asked to do this. You now get sentences like X because Y. X because Y, after because comes the justification, the why, of your answer to the question. In that justification, you have to use the facts from the example. This is called a perception argument. Of course, here you have argumentation theories, which is also a subject on its own. And I can't elaborate on that today, but it's of course very important to know the technique of argumentation, and also fallacies, for instance, come into this. In addition, you can add a general conviction of yourself. That conviction can come from your own displacement of just now or from someone, somewhere else. Now, the interviewer of the lead or the leader of the dialogue is not recording all the answers on the flip over, but above all, he tries to write down conflicting answers, because that's very interesting, of course. If everybody is saying the same without contradiction, without conflict, well, that's a little bit hard to start a dialogue. So you have to have conflicting answers. And one of these answers was, you can intervene if your own border is crossed. An observational argument for this was, I think something is happening in the classroom that is in fact not done. It's going to exceed my border. The conviction is, I have to guard my own border and also that of the school. And you see here in the elenchus-phase, in order to get deeper into the essence of the argumentation phase, the conversation leader lets the statements compare. In particular, attention to contradictions between the statements, and the contradictions in statements made by one person provides thinking for the participants. It's not only a contradiction in statements of different persons, but also the contradiction while explaining, while arguing that someone is contradicting himself. And that is also, of course, very interesting in the dialogue itself. For instance, the conversation leader says, I hear that two people are talking about responsibility, person one and person two. Are person one and two talking about the same thing? And this led to an intensive dialogue here, in this case, between the attendees. The conversation leader intervenes as little as possible, but tries to deepen thinking from time to time by asking for words the participants use. What do you mean by that? Can you explain that to the others? And then, of course, you come to the last phase, the essence. And here, in that case, it came out that the group comes to the following statements, the principles. The context determines whether you give someone advice about their appearance or not, and standards guard you all. Of course, in other dialogues with the same team, maybe other essences would emerge from such dialogue. The benefits of Socratic thinking. If you, for instance, in organization, if you want to make better use of unconscious wisdom within your team and your organization, or if you want to discuss dilemmas, for instance, is also a benefit. Reflection on cooperation and or behavior, or for the development of a vision, or rethinking guiding principles, or testing the behavior against the guiding principles. Connect different cultures, for instance, interdepartmental. Right? You can have an organization with different cultures within the same organization, and you want to connect them. Huh? Learn to listen better and ask questions, also benefit. Adapt the right attitude for the learning organization. When is Socratic thinking useless? Well, above all, don't have a Socratic conversation to pretend you want to give others a say. People know that right away. If you start a dialogue and the others are not convinced that they have a say in it, don't do that. A Socratic conversation is a genuine investigation to find out what you didn't know yet. And so if you already know because you still want to stick to your opinion, or because the regulations leave no choice, then you don't have to start a Socratic investigation. If you think you know better, or if you are limited by rules, for instance, which you can't ignore, then of course a Socratic investigation or Socratic talking is useless. Even if the answer is obtained through existing knowledge or through consultation of an expert, you do not have to have a Socratic conversation, of course. The Socratic conversation is only suitable when you are looking for an answer that can be obtained through joint thinking. Not when you want to win a conversation, because that's really arguing and in fact a kind of debating. You will not tolerate interferences from others. I know many people like this. Or you have certain interests and you want to push them through. Or you are offended if others don't agree with you. When someone is saying something else, and you do not agree, or you're not pleased with it, then don't do a Socratic thinking or conversation. If you are not prepared to review your starting points from time to time, it's just by Socratic thinking. Think again on the regressive abstraction. You have to find out what your pre-assumptions were, presuppositions, and so on. if you are not prepared to do that, to review what you think you always have in mind and what is true and what is right, and think that another one can be also right, that the truth is not only something that you possess, but also others, then you don't have to do a Socratic thinking. You think your habits are by definition good, or a quick decision is more important than a good decision. Socratic thinking is in fact slow thinking. It's delaying your judgment. So it's not a question of a quick, to make decisions in a quick way. You have to talk about you, to dialogue, to have a decision. And that's the important thing. Or if you think that others can't add anything to your wisdom, then you don't have to do some Socratic dialogue. We come to the last thing, and then we have, I think, room for questions that will be there, of course, within the group. 6 is, in what fields is Socratic thinking applied? Very briefly, in education, of course, in the classroom with students, but also for leadership development, team consultations, and so on. Care institutions, dilemma interviews. What should I have done with that patient, for instance, in medical care? Financial institutions, commercial organizations, governments. I will not elaborate, and I rather have some questions from you that I like to answer. Maybe a last thing, the Socratic conversation can be used in different ways: a one-to-one advisory interview with the group, in a therapeutic conversation, or in everyday communication. If you don't want to advise other persons, you can always gain insight yourself. Now, of course, it's very difficult to put everything in a very condensed PowerPoint in a lecture, but I hope I gave you a little bit insight of Socratic thinking. But there's much more more to know about Socratic thinking, of course, but that would take me many more hours. I thank you for watching, and I'm open to questions. Now I have to go back to, I think, Marta.
Yes, Jan, you can unshare your screen, maybe, if that's okay, and then you can see everybody, and including your
yeah.
I will do some traffic management in terms of questions and comments. So just anybody who wants to say something or ask something, remember that you are muted. So first you need to unmute. And if you are able to locate the button which allows you to raise your hand, it should be somewhere at the bottom of your window. Then I will see who is raising this in this
okay.
Your hands, and then I will tell you what is the queue, and we'll tell you when it's your turn, so that you know, like, we don't speak simultaneously, because in this tool, when we start speaking simultaneously, it kind of like it's
okay. I have a little drink before I start.
Yeah, so yeah,
it's non-alcoholic, you know, but
maybe I'll take out your screen already. Yeah. And then everybody can see more people if you have selected the option gallery view. Then you see.
Yeah, okay, I see that. Yeah, I have the.
And this is something you need to do in your in your software. Okay, so
I'm staying at the beach.
Yeah, that's nice. That's nice. It was funny, at some point you were moving the chair and it made a sound that wasn't consistent with the setting you are in. So kind of, but other than that, you look very, very vacation-like. So who would like to say something or ask or comment? Nobody.
You should explain Putting your hand up.
Yeah, I was trying, but you have to locate your raise your hand somewhere in the bottom. There's a option
Images.
Under the participants.
Yes, under the, you click on participants, and then there should be something.
Then you say at the right under, raise hand.
I see it differently, so this is why I'm not really specific.
Okay.
Anyone?
Any questions?
Any questions? Okay, I'll start something. I was listening to you describing a method, things that I'll tell you what I was paying attention to. Maybe it's not a question. It's to put into the what you were saying into kind of a bit of the names or concepts that we've been using in the school of thinking. This is what happens when you have a particularly beautiful mind, or somebody admirable, somebody influential, somewhere, at some place and some time, and then many people start doing the same, right? So the person transforms into a method, right? And the person is located in time and in a particular context, which is a combination of the personality, style of interaction, just the way that this particular guy is, with the situation in which the field is at the moment, right? So it's the state of the art of philosophy, how philosophy was done then, and the methods and kind of understanding interests of philosophy at the time, and also something that is mostly probably methodical. It's not what is investigated. It's not the style of the person, but methodology in more epistemological way. And then the whole bundle becomes the method to which as far as I understood, other people's ideas come in and other applications and so on and so on. So then the person transformed into a method transforms into a field of practice.
Yeah, well, let me answer this very briefly. We were talking this morning about how can you put ideas, or how can you change ideas within other people. Huh?
Mm-hmm.
I think this Socratic way, if it's done in a correct, in a good way, then you can infuse or change the thinking of the person who is thinking. So that's in fact, that was our question this morning. How can you affect the thinking of someone else?
Mm-hmm.
Now, what Socrates is doing is doing that, in fact, but to my feeling is that he is doing that a little bit too enthusiastic. In this way, he is in fact giving answers to the other ones. He's not infecting the mind of the other ones. He's saying it. Huh?
Yeah.
And in fact, in nowadays dialogue, the changing of the thinking would come from those who are addressed in the dialogue.
Yeah, it doesn't seem that was his interest. If his research was into abstraction, understand, this kind of essentialist understanding what is a notion other than apart or outside of its usage, in people, in situations. So then it was empirical field work to extract from those places, those usages. What do you mean? What do you mean? What do you mean? As a way
of course, he's using the experience itself, huh? Only experience, no hypothetical things. He didn't want that. It was the experience on the field, which were the starting point of the
starting point, but the aim, The aim.
The aim was to, yes,
abstraction, right?
yeah, the aim was to redirect in a certain way the thinking of the one who was giving or the one who was in that experience.
Yeah.
Huh?
Two people want to speak, Bruno and then Weaver. Bruno?
Yeah.
Yes, I have a question. So when you have philosophical questions, then Socratic method seems indeed quite interesting. If you want to know, is there a God? Okay, you can discuss with somebody else. But if you have more questions that are more action-oriented, you want really to know a solution. How do we get out of this coronavirus crisis? How do you and how do you do that then? Because Socratic method, you don't really reach actions or getting to the truth.
Well, of course, people who are deciding what they will do with the corona virus. I take the example of now what is to be done within a few days. Tomorrow, Friday, they will announce the exit of
the new measures,
the gradually exit of the corona rules they made. There, of course, they took some perspectives of the economic perspective, the financial perspective, and so on and so on. So they are comparing those different perspectives, and they are weighting these perspectives. In a Socratical way, one could say, okay, this is what is happening. How would I have done this? How would I was thinking? How would I have? What feeling would I have? And what would I have done in that when I was in the situation of the HES? I think it's HES, the Commission for the Exit of Corona. So you can have a discussion on we are of course not in fact within that example immediately within that experience, of course, but they can the ones who have to decide are of course in that experience, and they have to make that conversation, that dialogue. We only experience the effects of what they are saying, but we are not in the experience of the claims they are making.
Now Weaver and then Marco Lin. Weaver?
Okay, first just a short question of curiosity. Can you say something about, was Socrates an historical person, or is it a figure of imagination, a literary figure? Do you have any knowledge about?
You mean if Socrates lived in reality, or what? Yeah.
Yeah, that's just out of curiosity. This
Well,
is
sometimes you could say maybe he didn't live. It's not a real person, but I think he was, because it's not only Plato who is speaking about Socrates, of course. Of course, it's very difficult because Socrates never wrote something himself, but from other facts, or you can say, well, Socrates has been someone alive and kicking.
and the second question is.
But to answer you further, that question is. We don't know if what is said in those dialogues is the opinion of Socrates or is the opinion of Plato. Is it the projection of what is Plato who was a student of Socrates? Is what is said by Socrates the projection of what Plato was saying, in fact, or the ideas of Plato?
I have another question. Is it's a kind of a reflection from what you described. It seems to me, and I want to connect it to the discussion that we have had earlier in the thinking studio. It seems to me that the way that you describe this Socratic method or variations of method, there is something that unites the participants, is that there is something like the truth that all of them want to uncover, discover, or otherwise, just to find the truth and from there to continue. Now we know that in real situations with real people, with real experiences, and especially with topics that are really people care about, people have opinions and convictions that are not necessarily come under this ideal of being united to find the truth. So can you say a few more things about the boundaries, defined boundaries between this assumption of unity about the direction of the dialogue, and maybe real life situations where there are truly unique or singular perspectives meeting in a dialogue, and what happens then? It's not necessarily pursuing the truth per se.
No, but well, you can of course have dialogues in many situations. We have, for instance, we learn students to have dialogues with their students or with their pupils in schools. I have now a student who is making a thesis with me using Socratic dialogue in the situation of clinics, where they come in situations where something happened in the field. They have no answer one-to-one to have a solution which is maybe correct or not correct, and they are investigating the solution which was given by the one who was experienced that situation, and they examine that in a dialogue, and they put themselves in the situation like I described here in the hourglass method. They put themselves in that situation. What would I have done in that situation? So by doing this, you get more the idea of is my acting okay or not okay? Is my acting near the truth or not near the truth? And of course, it depends on context. Is that an answer, Weaver, for your question?
Yeah, partly. I would just I was interested in the function of the understanding of what is truth, or the concept of truth. What is the significance or importance of this to the successful conclusion or possession of Socratic of the Socratic method?
Of course, then you ask the question of what is truth, and of course, when you, for instance, say truth is what we agree intersubjectively with each other. That's the truth.
Oh, what is beautiful in the eyes of the gods? It's
yeah. That's one kind of definition. There's someone else.
Yes. Now Marco and then Benno. Okay, Marco. You need to unmute Marco.
I'm sorry. So thank you. It was really interesting. I'm mostly caught by this notion of active mirroring, which I really like, because the individuals all would have to be active mirrors. And it's a lot of other details in your talk that really evoke this question of to what extent it mirrors the whole participation, the whole dynamic itself, how much that mirrors a psychological processes, and how the Greek philosophers thought about that. You know, how the Socratic method in dialogue or discourse actually mirrors psychological processes of thinking about. Because another Belgian researcher, Laches, has a notion of participatory sense-making. And I think that really captures the theme that you've been exposing in Socratic methods. It's where the interaction or the interplay of active mirrorings or thinking interactions becomes an autonomy itself. And you can transfer that in a weird second order mirroring, as maybe people do that too, having within themselves the same discursive structure. And as a kind of extra question is, to what extent did they conceive of the variations of Socratic methods? You showed this three kinds of argumentation, and they kind of seem like three modes, right? Three emphases on what the argumentations or discourse should lead to. And I'm just wondering about your thoughts on that, if that makes sense.
Yeah. But what's your real question? Because the last bit I didn't understand very well.
So the last question was more about if it can be seen as mirroring a process of thought, then the three modes of argumentation can be seen as emphasizing different pursuits of what the thinking is for. You know, would you want certainty? Do you want common ground between disparate notions or domains of inquiry? Or do you want pragmatic or motivational understanding?
Yeah, but I used, of course, the mirror as a metaphor within the Ubuntu philosophy. Often we say the mirror is reflecting only yourself, but the mirror is not speaking back. In Ubuntu philosophy, the mirror is speaking back.
Exactly.
It means that the other one is coming into the dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
In the mirror, in fact, as we see it in our Western world, the mirror is only reflecting our own thoughts. In the Ubuntu philosophy, it's the mirror who is speaking back also, and that's in fact the dialogue. That's why I find the mirror, the metaphor of the mirror, in that sense, a very useful metaphor,
mm-hmm.
Because the others in the Ubuntu philosophy, there you have, in fact, you have three kinds of people in the Ubuntu. You have the living, those who are living today, but you also have the ones who are dead. But for Ubuntu, are the living, they call that the living dead, the living dead. And then you have the not yet born people. So, and why is this important? Because in those who are not, for instance, let's take the climate. If we mirror only with the people who are living now, we are not taking into consideration the effects of what we are doing with the not what we are doing with the climate, what the climate is doing with us, for the not yet born. And so we have to take that consideration also into that, and that mirror, that metaphor of mirror is telling us that. You see.
But could you maybe answer or provide some insight on the explicit question of whether people like Plato and Socrates and Aristotle actually had explicit opinions about how this discursive process is mirrored within the person? Because another metaphorical link that's kind of interesting is the notion of reflecting about things, right? So the whole process of reflection, not just metaphorically, but also formally in some theories in neuroscience, is that things are understood in terms of each other. And so the mirroring becomes very explicit, right? But more importantly, I don't want to go on a tangent again, but is there any existing statements or positions from these philosophers on how there's a parallel between this participatory process of discourse and the embodied process of discourse?
I didn't fully understand your question, in fact.
I mean, so the Socratic method is a method or an approach for engaging in dialogue, right? If that's correct. Yeah, and in that process, in that dialogue, it's effectively dynamic to arrive at more insight, wisdom, or knowledge, or common ground. However, that very much is a process that we need to do as individuals as well. And so I was wondering how that very process, maybe in abstraction, can be seen as occurring within a person as well. this is a very open question, but I was wondering whether they, at the time, also arrived at similar questions about this parallel.
Here you are asking if you can do this on your own also, no?
No, not it's more about the analogy. So I'm just explicitly asking whether they, Plato and the contemporary philosophers, had saw parallels or analogies or syllogisms between that process, its function or its dynamics within the person themselves. For example, this training of noticing contradictions or finding common grounds, or that hourglass figure, right? Distilling the rules and the principles.
All starts with the idea that you don't know. You don't know.
Okay.
You have to admit that you know. You don't know a lot. You don't know. Because if you say I know it, you don't have to have a dialogue, because if you are the wisdom yourself, why have a dialogue? So it's investigation of your own thoughts, your own presuppositions, your own prejudices, and so on, and reflecting it with other ones continuously. And it's slow thinking, it's waiting for judgment, waiting for making judgments too early. I think Martha Jacques wants to say something.
Yes, first Meno.
Meno, yeah,
I
okay.
have this cue here. Yeah.
Yes, Meno.
Yeah, with regard to Socratic investigation, yeah, you say don't apply it if you know, but what about in teaching? You know, when you are a professor or you're in front of a group, you know, but the group doesn't know. Does that apply or not?
Yeah, yeah, I see what you mean. Of course, the teacher knows, but you have to see it in the context of, instead of giving all the ready answers to the pupils, you have to try that the pupils find the truth themselves, find the answers themselves, and you got. That's why I said there's no hierarchy between the teacher and the pupils, but there is a kind of coaching. He's near. The teacher is nearby. And he's helping. And the pupil is trying to understand for himself. And when he is stuck with the right questions, he tries to emerge the knowledge out of giving birth to that knowledge to the pupil.
Okay.
So he knows, but of course in Socratic days, when he was saying, I know nothing, I don't know that I know, he said there's only one thing I know, that is that I know that I don't know, and the others think they know. So of course he's a smart teacher, a smart coach. And the proof that he was knowing very well was because I showed you in a little extract of dialogue, he was giving for instance, in the Meno, the slave is proving the doubling of a square. The slave is not answering, which in the situation of the Socratic method, he would have done so. The slave would have given the answer. No, it's Socrates who is giving the answer, and the slave says, "Oh yes, that's it, Socrates. Yes, I believe it's like this, Socrates." They are confirming what the Socrates is saying. So this is
okay. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Next person, Serge.
Thank you, Jan, for your PowerPoint presentation and for the lecture. Given from Southern Beach, I see. My impression is that the method is certainly valuable, but only in rather academic situations. Because if you use the method in normally conversations or even in meetings, the application of the Socratic way of questioning will annoy people. And they will certainly condemn you, if not like Socrates to death, then they will consider you as an unpleasant companion.
Yeah. I completely agree, Leo, because of course you can't use, for instance, that Socratic method like I explained it now in a classroom. That's, well, then after 10, 15 minutes, they all run out of the classroom. But there are other methods who use the idea of Socratic method, the principle of the Socratic method, but in another way, in a way that is suitable for schools. For instance, McCall with the COPI method, the Community of Philosophical Inquiry. There are other methods, Brenifier, Tozzi, for instance, a very good method. Michael Tozzi. There's a very good book in French written by him, explaining without the big words. Of course, someone who is dealing with Socratic thinking must know the everything, of course, but he is not expressing that to the pupils or showing his knowledge within a group, within a dialogue, because that would be,
misuse.
Misuse. Now he has to deal with the situation, and you can have a philosophical dialogue in a Socratic way, but which is pleasant to do.
Thank you.
But you are right when you say, don't do this in the hourglass method, because that's impossible. But I only wanted to give this as an example of how this thing is structured, of course. And for instance, the students at the University of Ghent are doing Socratic talking, but not using that method, of course. They are using a method that is suitable for education and for school.
Thank you.
Okay.
Now, Serge, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope that everybody can hear me.
Yes, Serge, yes.
I think there are two very big cases. One is where the final result is known, let's say the truth. The other one where the final result is not known. And applying Socratic principles to both is an interesting given. I think that, and CLEA has already mentioned it, the influence of the role of the leader in cases where the solution is not known can be very great. And I'd be interested in knowing if repeatability has been experienced in such cases. Probably it has. In those cases, on the other hand, and it has also been spoken about, where the ultimate result is known, I think didactically speaking, it is very much more preferable, or at least advantageous, to go directly to the distribution of the information rather than the involved process of Socratic thinking. Although living a process like that can, of course, be enlightening for students in order to understand how people come to reasoning. But my question was, and particularly to the point remarked on Corona, it doesn't make any sense to try to apply a Socratic discussion to the Corona outcome. This is a technical matter, and it's much more efficient to use other techniques than this one. So those two different types of, I would say, Socratic discussion, where it is known in beforehand and where the answer is not known, I think they're different, fundamentally.
Of course, I can answer this in different ways. First of all, what we see in education today, mostly, is that the teacher is saying, okay, for instance, in mathematics or in whatever subject, okay, this is it, and he follows, and he says, okay, this is how it goes. Here is my explanation. Without an example, or without examples, without the practical impact of what he is saying. For instance, let's take the example of a square plus b square equals c square. Okay, Pythagoras. Well, if you say to students, this is the formula, and you don't give the practical implication of that formula, they will make, well, maybe this one, but other proofs, they will not remember that within 20 or 30 years. But if you say, I give you an example, for instance, you have a square lake, and there's something you want to measure the diagonal, but you have you can't swim, or there are crocodiles in the water, so you can't measure in the water, but you can do it otherwise, and then explain what Pythagoras was saying. If you know the one square and the one length and the other length, and you square it and you use that formula, then you have the diagonal. Diagonal. So it all comes to the starting from a certain experience and getting back to the foundation of that experience to make that abstraction. Where comes it from? Of course, here in mathematics, it's from the formula to the reasoning to the elements. But for claiming, for instance, in other cases, it's coming up to presuppositions, prejudice, and so on. And there people can see how it comes that they arrived at that situation. Why am I saying this? What is in my mind to say this? And you have to find it out. And in dialogue, you can be, someone else can show you why you are making a wrong conclusion, why you are making not the right conclusion, and because you have deduced or induced in the wrong matter.
Is there anybody else who would like to say something or ask a question?
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes.
Professor, thank you very much for your expose. Could we then get the recording, and do we get the recording, and do we get the slide presentation? Is it possible?
Yes, Jacques, I as mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, I will send my PowerPoint to Marta, and of course she will send, well, I will send to everyone who is asking me by mail where the recording can be found. But I have to look at Marta, who is nodding yes. Yes, but she has to give me the link so that we can, so that I can, well, Marta is sending this to the group of the students of the VUB, but if you, you have my email address, I believe, so you can mail me, and then I can send it. The PowerPoint is rather big, so I have to send it by something like Smart or whatever. So you have 5 or 6 days to download it before it disappears.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Bravo.
You're welcome.
Any more questions?
No, well done. Everything well done.
Super. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you. Have a good night.
You too.
You.
And stay safe, everybody.
Yep.
Bye bye. Marta, bye bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone.